going into this week, talking about Chapter 4, Diversity and Culture. I'm just going to go through things pretty quickly this week because this is one of those I would consider very self-explanatory type of chapters. And I pretty much follow the chapter to a T when it comes to the PowerPoint. So first, you have to understand the difference between sex and gender. First of all, sex is a biological term. Biologically female versus biologically male. There's also the other category that exists now as well. So it's just one of those things that people ask, sex, male or female. It's definitely a biological construct. The gender construct is different. It is the psychological understanding of how you interpret things. Do you interpret things from a masculine perspective or do you interpret it from a feminine perspective? That has no impact on biological sex. Two very different concepts. How does that affect communication? Masculine communicators tend to have a more report approach when communicating. It's very much, I did this, we did this. It's reporting information. It's about receiving information from somebody else. It's in a report type of format. Versus the feminine perspective, which is more about rapport. It's about being able to sit down and talk to each other and understand where everybody's coming from. Being able to learn people's perspectives and things like that. And that's where you see a difference in how genders communicate. Genders communicate. Remember, a male can have a feminine perspective and have a more rapport approach. Sexual orientation. Something that we definitely need to discuss when we talk about diversity. Heterosexuality is not the only thing that exists. There's also homosexuality. There's transsexuality. There's a lot of different areas there. And you have to look at sexual orientation and realize that it's not necessarily a fluid concept. So, you have issues that come out of this. You have the idea of homophobia, irrational fear or aversion to or discrimination against homosexuals in our society. That's a problem that's been developed. Sexual orientation versus sexual preference, also something that's different. Just because you have one particular sexual orientation doesn't really mean that you have a change in sexual preference. It's two different things. Is the terminology really a big deal? Yes, it is. It's very important to understand that terminology and understand where those differences align themselves. Race and ethnicity. Obviously, when we're talking about diversity, we have to talk about race and ethnicity. Understand that these are the differences. You have race, which is the genetic, physical characteristic of a group of people. Then you have ethnicity, which is a social classification based on traits such as nationality, religion, language, and heritage or race. So ethnicity is different than race. You have to understand the difference between those two. Discrimination happens to both, not just race, but also ethnicity. Unfair treatment towards someone based on their particular group membership, based really on how you were born. You were usually born into a race, or you were born into an ethnicity. You had no choice about it, but discrimination still exists. It's that unfair treatment that exists, and that's a problem we have to face. Age. Age is definitely different for everybody. You have a generation gap. Baby boomers view things a lot differently than Generation Xers. Xers deal with things differently than millennials do. The generation gap is definitely something that you have to pay attention to, and you have to know and understand that there's age discrimination. Millennials don't view baby boomers as people who really are important in society. When you look at it, baby boomers are the bosses, and millennials are supposed to be the entry level, but the millennials want to be the bosses, and they feel like they're replacing the baby boomer generation. Gen Xers are looking for a balance in life, the balance between family, and also looking at the balance between work and how to manage those types of things. And their relationship with millennials is very different as well. So you see that there's a lot of different age discrimination that can happen. but also age issues. Social class. Argyle says that there are cues or ways to understand social class. Way of life, family, job, money, education. These are all cues to understanding different social classes. How do these emerge? Hierarchy, which one's in power? Which one's the most important? Interacting with your own social class, that creates different social class. Interaction over time makes communication similar. So if you interact with people, you tend to communicate on a similar front. We communicate our social class to others, basically almost through material means. So things like dress, the car you drive, your home, what schools your kids go to, etc., things like that. That's how you communicate your social class to others. And it can change. You could start in a lower social class and move to a higher one, or move from a higher one and go to a lower one. If you want to see a really good example of that, I would definitely check out the movie Coming to America. You see two men, older white men, who, if you ever watched Trading Places, they were characters in Trading Places, who lost everything. They went from being rich to poor. Well, then they meet... It's funny because Eddie Murphy is responsible for both of their directions. In the first movie, he's responsible for tearing them down and sending them to the poorhouse. And in the next movie, he plays another character who's responsible for giving them a bag of money and making them rich again. So you see that you can change that based on education, employment, and your income. Income is probably the biggest thing that can change your social class. If you won the lottery, would you have the same friends as you do today? It's definitely something you have to think about. So understanding culture. Culture is a learned system. We learn it from where? We usually learn it from our parents. We learn it from our families. They're where we learn most of it. We also learn it from our friends. We learn it from school. We learn it through education. So those are other places that we learn our culture. Worldview. So a general perspective on issues such as death, God, and the meaning of life. Different cultures have different perspectives on these. Our own culture has different perspectives on these. So things you have to take into account. Co-cultures are cultures within a culture. So if you think about American culture, you think that there are tons and tons of different co-cultures that exist. I would say that I'm a member of nerd culture. So video games, board games, Magic the Gathering, I told you before, I would fit under that category. There's other co-cultures that exist. There's athletes. You can base it off of your job. Teachers, students, those would be different co-cultures. So there's lots of different co-cultures that exist within the main culture, is what we call American culture. So how do we get it? Well, a couple of things like that. Like I told you, enculturation, transmitting your culture from one generation to the next. So learning it from the people who have experienced the culture before. Behaving in accordance with those cultural norms. There's other ways to learn that as well. Let me go back to the previous slide. I think we missed something. No, we didn't. We're going to keep going. Cultural expression. So the idea of individualism versus collectivism. American culture, very individualistic. Other cultures, like Asian cultures, very collectivistic. Dealing with, the group rather than an individual. Context is also there as well. So high versus low context. How high context, how much nonverbal communication can you understand in a particular culture? We talked about masculine versus feminine in terms of culture a little bit. Uncertainty, how much rules for behavior have to exist for you to understand communication. Power, is power centralized in a culture, or is it decentralized? Is it more equal and distributed? And then time, future-oriented versus present-oriented, monochronic versus polychronic. Those are definitely things you have to think about in terms of how you deal with other cultures. Some barriers. First of all, culture shock. You definitely, when you go and see a culture for the first time, you can experience confusion, anxiety, loss when encountering a new culture. You feel like you may have lost something, especially if you're in that culture for a long period of time. Ethnocentrism. Before I go to that real quick, reverse culture shock is also a problem. Coming back to your own culture, you tend to be confused, experience anxiety, experience loss there as well. So that can take place. Ethnocentrism, the belief that your culture is more superior to others, something you don't want to have. You don't want to have that barrier. Making assumptions, assuming that your culture is the same as others. That's a bad assumption to make. Or assuming that your culture is different than others. Also a bad assumption to make. It's important to educate yourself about different cultures and know how other cultures deal with certain things. That's all we're going to talk about today. Next week, we'll get into Chapter 5. Make sure that you take care of the exam for this week for Chapter 4. I'll have that posted. Take care and have a good week, everybody.